Fifth and finally, destructive. Although seemingly less brutal than physical methods, CIA's no-touch torture actually leaves searing psychological scars. Victims often need long treatment to recover from a trauma that many experts at torture treatment centers across the United States consider more crippling than physical pain. Indeed, just this month, Dr. Metin Basuglu, a psychiatrist and prominent special in torture trauma treatment at King's College London, has published a study in the Archives of General Psychology finding from interviews with 279 survivors from Yugoslavia that the mean distress rating for physical and psychological or non-physical stressors were in the same range. Part 2, propagation. After codification in the 1963 Kubark Manual, the CIA spent the next 30 years propagating these torture techniques among anti-communist allies across Asia and Latin America. And although the agency trained military interrogators from across Latin America, our knowledge of the actual torture techniques transmitted comes from a single handbook for a Honduran training session, the CIA's Human Resources Exploitation Manual, 1983. Again, if you wish to read this manual for yourself, just go to your laptop or desktop and Google the phrase Human Resources Exploitation Manual. To establish control at the outset, the questioner should, the CIA instructor tells his Honduran military trainees, quote, manipulate the subject's environment to create unpleasant or intolerable situations, to disrupt patterns of time, space, and sensory perception. To effect this psychological disruption, this 1983 handbook specified techniques that seem strikingly similar to those outlined 20 years earlier in the Kubark Manual and those that would be used 20 years later at Abu Ghraib prison. When the Cold War came to a close, Washington resumed its advocacy of human rights, ratifying the UN Convention Against Torture in 1994 that banned the infliction of severe psychological and physical pain. Now, on the surface, the United States had, by ratification of this convention, apparently resolved the tension between its anti-torture principles and its torture practices. Yet when President Clinton sent this UN convention to Congress for ratification in 1994, he included language drafted 8 years earlier by the Reagan administration with 4 detailed diplomatic paragraphs of reservation focused on just one word in the 26 printed pages of the UN convention. That word was mental. Significantly, these intricately constructed diplomatic reservations redefined torture, as interpreted by the United States, to exclude sensory deprivation and self-inflicted pain, the very techniques the CIA had refined at such great cost in decades past. This definition was reproduced verbatim in domestic legislation enacted to give legal force to this UN convention, first in Section 2340 of the U.S. Federal Code, and then in the War Crimes Act of 1996. Now, remember that obscure number, Section 2340, for it is the key to unlocking the meaning of the controversial Military Commissions Law enacted by the U.S. Congress just last September. A year later, in 1995, the Clinton administration launched its covert campaign against al-Qaeda. The CIA avoided direct involvement in torture by sending some 70 terrorist suspects to allied nations notorious for brutal physical torture, a practice called extraordinary rendition, which was supposedly banned by the UN treaty. In effect, Washington had split the UN convention down the middle, banning physical torture but exempting psychological abuse. By failing to repudiate the CIA's use of torture, while adopting a UN convention that condemned its practice, the United States left this contradiction buried like a political landmine, ready to detonate with such phenomenal force just 10 years later in the Abu Ghraib prison scandal. Part 3, perfection. Right after his public address to a shaken nation on September 11, 2001, President Bush gave his White House staff wide secret orders saying, quote, I don't care what the international lawyers say, we are going to kick some ass. In the months that followed, administration attorneys translated their president's eloquent but otherwise unlawful orders into U.S. policy by 3 neoconservative Leo doctrines. 1, the president is above the law. 2, torture is legally acceptable. And 3, the U.S. Navy base at Guantanamo Bay is not U.S. territory. To focus on the single doctrine most germane to psychological torture, Assistant Attorney General Jay Bybee found grounds in his now notorious August 2002 memo for exculpating any CIA interrogators who tortured but later claimed his or her intention was information instead of pain. Moreover, by parsing UN and US definitions of torture as severe physical or mental pain. Bybee concluded that pain, equivalent to organ failure, was legal, effectively allowing torture up to, but not including, death. But less visibly, the Bush administration began building a global gulag for torture at Abu Ghraib, Bagram, Guantanamo, and a half dozen additional sites worldwide. In February 2002, the White House assured the CIA that the administration's public pledge to abide by the Geneva Conventions did not apply to its operatives, and the White House also allowed the agency 10 enhanced interrogation methods designed by agency psychologists, including waterboarding. This technique, which simulates drowning, was earlier called tortura gallicae ordinariae, or standard French torture, in a 1541 French judicial handbook, and it would now become what CIA Director Porter Gauss called in March 2005 a professional interrogation technique. Standard French torture in 1541, professional interrogation technique 2005, such is the path of human progress on this topic. There are several methods for achieving this effect. The simulation of drowning can be achieved by several methods. For example, by forcing the victim to lie prone and then constricting breathing with a wet cloth, as was done by the French Inquisition and the CIA today, or by forcing water into the lungs, as was done by French paratroopers during the Algerian War. After French paratroopers used this technique on him during the battle for Algiers in 1957, the journalist Henri Alleg wrote a moving description of his experience that turned the French people against both torture and the Algerian War. I tried, Alleg wrote, by contracting my throat, to take in as little water as possible and to resist suffocation by keeping air in my lungs for as long as I could. But I couldn't hold on for more than a few moments. I had the impression of drowning, and a terrible agony, that of death itself, took possession of me. Let us think about the deeper meaning of Alleg's sparse words. A terrible agony, that of death itself. As the water blocks air to the lungs, the human organism's powerful mammalian diving reflex kicks in, and the brain is racked by horrifically painful panic signals, death, death, death. Then the victim vomits out the water, the lungs suck in air, the panic subsides. And then it happens again and again and again and again, each time inscribing the searing trauma of near death in human memory.